Welcome to the Kickass Couples Podcast. This is the place where we help committed couples who want to level up their marriage experience newfound clarity, hope, and confidence. We're Matthew and Kim, co-hosts and husband and wife.
In 26 years together, we've seen a lot and never thought it could be as good as it is right now. We're here to help you successfully navigate the messy, dirty, and wonderful world of marriage.
We believe all couples deserve and are capable of experiencing an extraordinary and fulfilling marriage. And each week, we're bringing you life lessons from real-life successful couples to help you grow and strengthen your relationship.
And now, let's dive into today's episode.
I remember we both dated a good bit, and I was engaged actually once before we met.
Ooh, I wasn't happy about that.
So both of us came into the marriage deeply wounded.
But quite physically, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically abusive because of the mental illness.
And one day I overheard my dad on the phone talking to a woman he was having an affair with. Many times when couples come into therapy, they kind of very subtly want to talk about what each other does or doesn't do. Take ownership.
Knowing your differences and then accepting them and realizing really God says grow. So
I think you need to take ownership of your part of whatever's going on in the conflict.
We'll get started right after this message. If you want to learn how to experience the best, most fulfilling year of your marriage, we invite you to pre-order Matthew's new book, Kickass Husband, Winning at Life, Marriage, and Sex. You can get it at MatthewPHoffman.com. Again, that's MatthewPHoffman.com. And now, back to the show.
So, welcome. And, we are so excited to have Doctors Tom and Beverly Rodgers. They have been Christian counselors for over 30 years. And you all have the Rodgers Christian Counseling and the Institute for Soul Healing in Charlotte, North Carolina. You're neighbors to us, kind of new neighbors. We just moved to Greenville, South Carolina. So we're not far from you all, and we love Charlotte. So we'll get over there and have to connect with you when we do. And you guys have PhDs. You both have masters. You're authors of 4 books. After I read your bios, I felt a little embarrassed because I think I need to get a little more done to catch up to you all. So I hope it's going to take us some time to get there. But I know that one of your books was called Soul Healing Love, and that was really led in, I think, or was representative of the model that you all developed called Soul Healing Love Model. So we look forward to hearing a little bit more about that. You've been married more than 30 years. 2 grown daughters and 1 grandson. Is that correct?
No, well, actually, it's a little bit of an old bio. I probably should have updated it. We have been married 44 years.
Oh my goodness.
And
yeah, I was 12 when we got married. Bev was 10. So.
Nobody's buying it anymore, Matthew. Nobody's buying it.
Yeah.
And now it's up to 6 books and 4 grandkids.
Wow.
That keeps us busy. The books kind of stalled out when the grandkids started multiplying.
Yeah.
So a lot of the spare time now is with them, but we've got a couple more books in our head. It's just time now to get them done.
Well, we're so glad to have you on today and grateful for the good work that you're doing out there. And we're gonna start this talk together off with our first question, which is we want to know from each of you, either one can go first, what makes you a kick-ass couple?
Well, honestly,
she has lots of patience.
It is hard work. And if people tell you that marriage isn't, then they don't know everything that we know. For the last 42 years, we've helped couples work through what we work through. We entered our marriage with so much baggage from our divorced homes. We had abuse. We had psychological, emotional, spiritual abuse, divorce. And so we entered our marriage with lots of baggage. And we thought, because we studied psychology and biblical literature, we were immunized. So I think what really helps us succeed as a couple is we continue to do our own personal work, healing the wounds of our past and our baggage. And we work together as a couple.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I could summarize it best. Our pastor, who was a mentor of mine growing up, he really was instrumental in my whole life. And he married us. And he told me one time, he said that the thing that makes a marriage good is thinking that each person got the better end of the deal. And I definitely think that's true with me. I definitely traded up in the draft here for Bev. I have several draft picks are going to be taken away in the next few years still. But I think we had a baseline respect for each other. When we first met and were dating, we spent a lot of time talking, and we have very similar values and goals, and things that we think are good strengths that complement one another. But when we got right down to it, I guess it was communicating the hard stuff and being willing to stay patient and communicate our way through issues rather than just reacting to them. And I think that's what really kind of helped us along the way.
The soul healing love model was developed not as two psychologists, it was developed to heal us because we were very fractured when we came in. And basically, the model is about healing the deep wounds we call soul wounds from the past, using neurobiological, psychological, and biblical underpinnings, biblical tools, techniques. And then basically, it helps you then do tools and exercises and talk and listen so that you change thoughts, patterns, and behaviors. Because we had some really bad patterns when we first got married. One was, since we came from a divorced home, if we got mad, we'd say, oh, it's not going to work. We just need to get a divorce. He was the worst offender than me. And one day I said, we can't say that anymore, because basically what you speak is your destiny. Thoughts have electromagnetic and electrochemical energy. When you throw that out there, it creates a negative destiny. So I told him, if we say it again, we better be willing to walk through it. And so both of us then started saying, we got to start healing. We got to start, because see, you'll see couples who want to communicate and they want to conflict resolve and they really want to be dedicated and be selfless, but their baggage inhibits them. They just fall right into the ditch, right out of the gate. They don't manage anger. They're blamers. They're full of shame. And so we had to heal a lot of that. And we see couples, just to get to the baseline, to be a couple that can communicate, they got to heal a lot of the stuff that they went through in their life or a previous marriage.
Yeah. So, Beverly, I hear you speaking a lot about your past, and that really leads to our next question. And that is, I'd love to know a little bit about your past. And I'd love to know, I really believe that we bring to our marriage a lot of our past. So it's sort of in our bones, right? We're the product of the people who raised us. And again, we bring that to the next relationship. So I'd like to know a little bit about your past and how love looked like to you when you were growing up.
It's such a good question. Like, how does love look like? We talk about what does love look like? What does family look like?
Right.
What does marriage look like? And that's like a disc that's imprinted on our brain. And even when we say, but we're so different, we're Christians, we study biblical literature, we're sound psychological people because we have degrees, we just smashed right up against each other. I came from a divorced home. My parents divorced when I was 5. Tom's parents divorced when he was 25. And we still have the same wounds, you know, the insecurity, the fear, marriage won't last. I also then was left with a single mom with 4 children, sort of sailing on the sea of the 60s, which was a very turbulent times. So we eventually realized mentally ill, but quite physically, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically abusive because of the mental illness, and also being left alone with 4 kids. So the brother launched off into the world of drugs and hippie and communal living, and that was very painful. So a lot of wounds from that, a lot of abuse, a lot of name calling and shaming, which coming as a Christian, coming to Christ, began to heal some of that. But also getting therapy and reading books and seminars and classes began to heal that as well. And I think healing, you know, is a process that takes a long time. Every now and then I can still get triggered, but Soul Healing Love gave us tools to get out of it so that we know how to talk about it and get through it.
What about
So my story is a little bit different than that. Sorry, Kim. My story is a little bit different. when we teach at times, we talk about abuse, and we kind of categorize it in two ways: active abuse and then passive abuse. And Bev's was very active. I mean, she was raised in a war zone. Her mother was physically uh, brutalizing to them, just emotional battering and all kinds of stuff. I was raised in a kind of on the surface, a calm, kind of regular family type situation. I was raised in the church. I was always involved in church stuff. I was an athlete. And life was pretty good for me until I was about 13. And one day I overheard my dad on the phone talking to a woman he was having an affair with. And my mom and my sister were gone, and I was on the phone, on the other phone, listening to him. Actually, our doctor called and was talking about some work he wanted to do on my leg. And my dad was injured at the same time. He wanted to talk to my dad. So I'm on the phone listening. And he begins to talk to this woman he's having an affair with. And my whole world, I mean, that was a defining moment for me. I can remember where I was. I can remember how I felt. It was as if, life was kind of on this path of ever doing better, and all of a sudden it is downhill, and it was that way from that point on. And sadly, I never looked at my father in the same way again. But it completely devastated me. And sadly, my mom and dad stayed married for another 11 years. During that time, my dad had so many affairs that we lost count. I caught him 3 times myself, but I wasn't raised in an abusive home. I wasn't verbally or emotionally abused. It was passive, it was subtle. But many times I think the passive wounds impact you more than the active, because it's so subtle, you just internalize it and adapt to it without even understanding fully what happened. And it developed a basic kind of hopelessness in me that when we first got married, if we had a conflict, I would pretty quickly say I knew it wasn't going to work. And it was just this fear, this hopelessness of living in this hope against hope relationship with mom and dad that they would work it out. And then ultimately they didn't. So both of us came into the marriage deeply wounded: inability to trust, inability to communicate effectively and resolve conflict, fear of doom, and a deep insecurity in relationships. And of course, we brought all that with us right into the marriage relationship.
Yeah, that's a lot of tough history to bring. So what was the beginning of that healing like for the two of you? Because you each came with these two radically different, dissatisfying backgrounds, probably thinking all the things you're not going to do, right? Yeah, we're not going to
Yeah.
have that.
Right.
And then you arrive with these two different realities. So how did the two of you take those two different realities and come together and make something that was built to last?
Well, I would like to say that it just kind of melded together like fingers in a glove. That would be lying on the podcast. I don't want to do that.
Sort of oil and water is what I'm thinking.
Yeah, it was more like this.
Yeah.
It was like 2 rams butting heads. It was difficult because
And also we're stubborn. Both of our personalities, we're strong natural leaders. And so we're stubborn. And so a lot of our conflicts, sometimes we're just dumb, but we were just determined that we were not going to get walked on because of our childhood. So the two of us, I tell people, if we can do it with our wounds, our personalities, other people can do it. That's why we shared our story. We started out as therapists, learning not to share too much personal information. And I will say, me studying to be a therapist and him studying to be a pastor in the very early part of our marriage was very, very helpful, because I learned a lot about why couples have conflicts, birth order, stubbornness, personality types, and then trying to make that information a transformation. So moving that, we got into therapy rather quickly. That was very helpful. And then we just took so much of what we learned from scripture, from good theories, good marital theories, good marriage workshops. And I have to say, we'd go to these marriage workshops where they would say, now, look in each other's eyes and get ready to write each other a love letter. And I'm like, oh, we're doomed. We may as well leave, Tom. Look at all these people. They're all happy, smiling. Barbie and Ken are up there and she's talking about her marital conflict. I'm like, sit down, sister. You got no clue. And I just felt like our childhood disqualified us, our life experience, until we really began, honestly, to gain some insight from some workshop, piece it together for us, gain some more, gain some insight from scripture. And eventually, we didn't realize it, but we were doing exercises from different things we learned and tweaking them and then healing our marriage. So I would try it out on a couple. I would go, gosh, this worked yesterday for us. And we thought that money issue would never be resolved. And we resolved it. In fact, we used a technique that we've developed that we've taught all across the globe now called the digging deeper, where you actually dig deeper and figure out what you're really fighting about. Instead of content, it's process. And we resolved our money conflict because he was a spender. I said, you were rich. You had carpet and indoor plumbing. He's like, wow, that's pretty scary because I grew up very, very poor. And so I'm like, you're just going to spend money. And we were in Chicago and he goes, I don't think a garage in Chicago is extravagant, but we fought about money. We resolved the money conflict and never had it again. And as we resolved it, he goes, so you think we're good? I'm like, yes, I do. And I just start sobbing. And he goes, but I thought we resolved it. And I said, that's why I'm crying, because I never thought we would ever resolve this issue and come to understanding. And this is overwhelming.
Well, I think it was an act of desperation too. I mean, we were in bad shape, and we both are pretty intuitive, and I think that's kind of a characteristic that we have as therapists. But we sensed that something deeper was going on. And I find this with clients all the time, that what they fight about is not really what they're fighting about. What they're fighting about is symptomatic of something very thematic that's much deeper, and many times is even unconscious. This kind of fear of doom thing for me, and this hopelessness. I mean, I wasn't aware of, and certainly didn't want to be that way in relationship, but it was very thematic in the life I lived growing up. So it tended to be.
Sorry, guys, meant to do that. Oops.
No worries.
Not a problem.
I have to be very careful when we speak. If I pause to take a breath, she jumps in.
I didn't jump in.
So if it wasn't her, it was the phone. But we began to sense that something deeper was being triggered, because many times our reaction did not fit with whatever the symptom of the problem was. You know, the symptom itself was kind of frivolous and silly, but when we reacted deeply, because it's impacting that insecurity, that fear of doom, that inability to trust, that's deeper in the soul, and many times kind of even unconscious. Sure. Until we begin to be aware of it.
So what I hear you both saying a little bit is you had these two histories, you came together, you really had to dig and get to the bottom of what it was that was triggering you or getting you off, so before you could go forward. And I think that's wise, because you handled the past so you could move forward. And in moving forward, we're going to talk about, it's kind of a nice lead in. We have these 13 pillars that we think are part of all successful relationships. And we're going to focus on 3 of those primarily today. We call them the 3 C's. And the first of those C's is commitment. And it sounds like you all had some similarities in what commitment did or did not look like in your past. But I'd love to hear, Tom, from you first. What does commitment look like in your relationship today with Beverly?
Commitment is no exits. You know, that's a therapy concept. There's no exits. And exits are things that you're passionate about more than you're passionate about working on your marriage. And so there's no exit. The door's locked from the outside. You can't get out. Once you say, I do, you're going to stick with it. Unless, we always say, unless there's abuse, unless there's utter neglect, or unless there's adultery. And then you have to really look at, can I heal from that? And we do get a lot of that. But in our case, exits, and they can be anything. Exits can be too much television. Exits can be the guy that's coaching the baseball team that spends far more energy on that all summer long than he does really connecting to his own children and his spouse. And exits can be that you're so passionate about work that it takes over everything. And so you really have to check when you look at commitment. Honestly, you got to look at your exits. You got to look at how you view staying connected. And we say do it on a regular basis. We have an exercise where you do like a family staff meeting or a marital staff meeting. And honestly, we say set the timer. It's no more than 20 minutes, but you would be surprised how many couples we have that go 20 minutes a week. You want us to take an evening and spend 20 minutes a week just talking, and you realize life takes over. Kids, sports, work, church, life takes over, and being committed just to have that connection once a week can be very difficult. So we always say check your exits, check what you're passionate about, check the energy that you put into being committed and saying, I'm here no matter what, through the long haul.
Right. So commitment to you looks like there's no exits. You're in it no matter what, and you're going to face and handle the issues. How about you, Tom? How do you see commitment come into play in your relationship?
Well, I guess the word that comes to me, Matthew, is priority. We always wanted to make our relationship a number one priority. And it sounds a little weird, but even above and beyond our commitment to our kids. I believe that as a Christian, my priority number one commitment is to the Lord. But commitment 1A is to Beth. Commitment 1B is to my girls. I remember when they were teenagers, they were upset with their mother one day, and they said something sarcastic about Bev to me. And I stopped them. I said, wait a minute. Now, you're not just talking about your mother, you're talking about my wife. And you're not going to talk about my wife that way. And they both looked at me kind of wide-eyed, like, oh my gosh, but it's funny, they never did that again to me.
Sure. I love that.
I think it was because we've always tried to make our relationship a priority. I remember we both dated a good bit, and I was engaged actually once before we met.
Ooh, I wasn't happy about that.
It's a long time ago. But I remember we both, our first date or two, we stayed up until 5 o'clock in the morning on our first date, just talking, just getting to know each other and telling our stories. And really our relationship began by communicating that way. And so I think it was different from any other relationship I'd ever had because we could communicate really well together and very deeply together. And we're both kind of deep oriented people in the first place. I remember my mom said to me when she first met Bev, she said, I knew the first time I met Bev that she was the one you were going to marry. And I said, well, Mom, how did you know that? And she said, because she is the only one you never tried to convince me that you loved. And I thought, she's a smart lady.
That's beautiful.
That's a pretty neat awareness. But I began to reflect on that, and I thought she's right. I never felt like I needed to convince anybody that I love Bev. And of course, who am I really trying to convince of these other girls? Myself. Yeah, sure. And I think we meshed together well, and we communicated well initially because it was a priority to us.
And I think I want to stop you because it doesn't sound funny to me at all. Our whole platform, right? Kickass Couples Nation, and this podcast is our uniqueness is prioritization. And when you talk about commitment, if your number one relationship, human relationship, I agree with you first, your faith, the Lord God is first, but the number one relationship has to be your marriage above anyone and anything else. And I love, we learned the idea when we had our first child that children are a welcome addition to the home. Mm-hmm. They're not the center of the home. And if this relationship isn't good, then everything can't go forward. So I really like that thought that you shared about commitment.
Yeah, and that actually leads us into our next pillar, which is communication. And you, Tom, you talked a little bit about that. Communication is so important, how we communicate, when we communicate. And I'd like to hear from you all. How are you communicating now in your marriage? I'm sure it looked a little different in the beginning. It sounds like it was a little tumultuous, that you really had to figure out where you were and where you wanted to be. But tell me now that things are different and you've been married all these great years, what does communication look like in your marriage now?
we developed a communication. Well, I say we developed, we struggled and worked and reworked to try to find a way to communicate. And so we have several exercises and tools that we developed, honestly, just trial and error on ourselves. And basically, it starts with stating a trigger and then talking about the emotion underneath the trigger. And then we move to, do I have reactivity from my past? Is it triggering something from my past? And then I own what I do. What do I do when that happens? What's my behavior? And then you got to own, okay, I get defensive, I get angry, I get highly reactive, but we carried it on to what I need. And so in the beginning, we would do the 5 steps called the digging deeper exercise in the soul healing love model. We do it over and over and over. And we tell couples, you'll get to where it'll become natural. See, so now we know each other so well after 44 years that we can tell, okay, if this is happening with you, that's triggering something. I can see what's going on there. And I bet I know what you need. Now, if I get it wrong, tell me, or you go ahead and tell me what you need. But it got to see, we would just fight and fight and fight and fight. And then it would be like, first of all, what started this? And then secondly, can we resolve it? And usually the answer was no, because we just get so ratcheted up. Well, this digging deeper helped us get to, this is what we really need. If you know what you need, if you know what you're looking for, you can get there. But often when couples come into our office, I'll say, what would it take for you to resolve this? And bless their hearts, they say, I don't have a clue. That's why I'm here. I'm like, I've been there. It's marital purgatory. You get started and you don't even know what started it, and you sure don't know how to end it.
Yeah.
So now we sort of do a version of that because we practiced it for, a good 30 years. And so, what helps us stay well in communication is quelling reactivity, which is giving a current situation more emotion than it deserves because the past is triggered, figuring out what's triggered, talking about it, trying to understand each other, and then stating our need in very practical ways to meet that need.
How about
Well,
you,
I think
Tom? Yeah.
there are 2 underpinnings to that. And I usually, when I work with clients, I talk about this in the first session. In our communication, I want them to be willing to do 2 things. Number 1, take ownership. Many times when couples come into therapy, they kind of very subtly want to talk about what each other does or doesn't do. So, they come in, the woman has a list of 469 different things that are wrong with the marriage, and they all have to do with him.
And he just wants her to get rid of the list.
Yeah, he wants her to get rid of the list and everything will be okay. But they talk about the problems in terms of what each other does or says, rather than what they do. And I found if you talk about what each other does, that ramps things up. If you take ownership, which is what part do you play in those issues, not what the other person does or doesn't do, then it's going to move us to a much deeper level of awareness and understanding. And it creates a motivation to help one another. So I think you need to take ownership of your part of whatever's going on in the conflict. And that's what you communicate about, what I do, why I do what I do, rather than what the other person does. The other thing I ask them to do is intentionality. And intentionality is the willingness to move in a healing direction, no matter what you feel. So in essence, you override your tendency to react so that you can respond to each other in a healing way rather than reacting. And if people are willing to take ownership and then be intentional in their communication with each other, they're going to move to a much deeper level of understanding. It will create a motivation to want to help one another. And then you move to what do we need? And it's interesting, guys, most of the time, or many times, people come in and we talk about what do you need other than the resolution of whatever your frustration is. And they'll look at us quizzically and they'll say, I don't know. I don't know. Because many times I think if we're raised in an environment where needs are not met, when we ask about what you need, many people don't know what they need. So we help them understand what that deeper need is and how we can meet that through healthy communication.
We have a cheat sheet that lists like soul needs, nurturance, security, safety, comfort, validation, affirmation. And because sometimes they'll look at it and go, oh no, I didn't get that, man. I didn't even know to ask for that. Oh, that was us. That was us. And so we just developed it so that people could go, yeah, that's it. Here's the definition. Now, the other thing we do is you got to put behavior to it. In behavioral marital therapy we were trained in, there's a slogan that says, if nothing changes, nothing changes. And you're like, yep, that's true. So you can talk and talk and talk, but if you don't say, this is the action we're going to take differently, we always say that punctuates the communication, is what are we going to do differently? Because if we don't come up with that, if we'll just end up, sort of rehashing and rehashing,
Sure.
but not saying practically, now what will we do differently in our communication?
So two things I hear from you all is it can't be you. It's not the finger pointing. You. It's I, right? I
Yes.
feel and that's the first thing. And then the second thing is once you've communicated using the I, then it's what do you need? And
Yeah.
communicating what you need so that they understand. And if each side does that, those two processes, then the communication will be effective. And then what Beverly was saying, we talk about, well, what behaviors then happen because that understanding has occurred through that communication.
Yeah. Well, and there's a misunderstanding that people bring into counseling many times too, Matthew, and that is that if we're married and you know me, then you ought to know what I need. And I always say, well, I think you have a much better chance of your needs being met if you talk about what you need. And I don't want us to do mind reading when it comes to our basic needs.
Well, I still remember one of our beginning therapy sessions. I was this naive, a true classic romantic. And I remember saying, like, why? I told the therapist, why should I ask for my needs? If he's my soulmate, he should just know. And the therapist said, oh, he's a Swami, huh? He can read minds. And I'm like, huh? He can read minds. Now, here's the thing. When you fall in love, there's a chemical cocktail that's released in the brain. You can actually sort of read each other. You get each other's signals. Well, that chemical cocktail wanes, and then you're just a mere mortal, and you're like, ain't getting me anymore. So you do sort of feel like you got me once and now you don't. But I had to realize that that was totally illogical, and that if I had a need, I really ought to tell him and not expect him to just read me and resent him if he didn't.
Yeah. And that's where I think that 20 minutes a day of communicating and sitting down, that's where that comes in. That's how we really get to know each other and share what we're thinking and share our goals and our aspirations and really start to dig a little bit deeper. If we don't do that, it's all surface.
Yeah.
And what is that?
Yeah, and then there's, that kind of leads nicely. Our next C, our third C is conflict resolution. If that communication isn't happening, then nothing's resolved. And so think of something that comes up in your relationship, in your marriage now, how do the two of you approach resolving those conflicts so you can move through them and get back to the good stuff?
Well, they're kind of two processes that I use. If we have conflict and we're stuck and we're not going to be able to communicate because we're reacting too much, then we will use the tools that we've developed, the gift exercise, which is understanding the primary emotions that are deeper rather than frustration or anger. So we move to a deeper level of communication, and then conflict resolution with the digging deeper exercise, the 5 steps that Bev talked about. If we're in a situation where we're just talking and we're not reacting, then I like to recommend that we do 3 things. When you begin to talk with each other, number 1, really listen to one another. Most people, when they begin to communicate, they listen to about 50% of what's being said, and then they start formulating their response, which many times means they're communicating with inadequate and inaccurate information. So I say, when you communicate with each other, really listen to one another. Try to understand what each other is saying, and it makes sense to you. You understand it. We call that validation. And validation is not agreement. It's not even saying that you're right and I'm wrong, or I agree with you or I don't. It's just saying, I understand. It makes sense to me when you communicate. So we listen well, we validate, and then we assure, we reassure, we encourage one another. And if we can communicate that way, many times, I think we can move to a much deeper level of communication with each other.
The other thing I see, like Gottman, Dr. John Gottman, who, if you talk about marriage, you're going to talk about Dr. John Gottman because he kind of cracked the code. He did all those studies and found out things that make marriages work and things that cause them to disintegrate. And he says that by research, about 65% of marital conflicts, you don't come to an agreement. If you want to look at agreement as resolvable, they're not resolvable. But he said, so a healthy couple actually can dialogue. And I like that he didn't say compromise, give in, make a deal, let's make a deal. They actually dialogue. And so that means, which is really, really hard. We got our work cut out for us. And when we see our clients is, can you hear the other person's perspective? And can you crawl inside their skin and see that that is their perspective? Now, you may not agree with it, but you can see it through their eyes. And so that then creates this kind of middle place. Like we'll use an example like raising children. And one's real, real strict. And I mean, he's going to be grounded for a year if he's late for curfew. And the other's like, wait a minute, no, let's hear him out. And there's a good cause. Well, one says, no, he's going to, not listen to rules if we're slack. And the other says he's going to rebel if we're too strict. Well, both have a point. Well, they may not agree, but if they can dialogue, then he crawls inside her skin. And here's what happens. When the kid is late for curfew, he's kind of the one that wants to say, okay, he's grounded for a year. And he goes, so why were you late? Do you hear what he's doing? See, he's actually kind of, well, let me think about this. And he goes, well, I took my girlfriend home because she was sick and it took a little longer and I wanted to be good to her. Oh, really? Now he could be fibbing you, but do you see how they're actually moving to a place in and out where there's a dialogue and understanding? Now, he still may say you're grounded, but he's actually picking up a little piece of her and she's picking up a little piece of him. And doing that is very helpful. And honestly, for us, we had some parenting things. I think he was stricter than me. I'm a mushball, but it is interesting. That kind of happened with us. Like he would say, no, grounded, that's it, done. And then he would come in with a softer perspective. And sometimes I would be, hold the phone. I think I'm getting played here. We're going a little tough on this one, because I think that's part of just being a couple is trying to crawl inside each other's skin and have an empathy for their perspective. Couples who are inflexible and not adaptable, and they're always right. You got an always right one in there. That is a hard, hard job. And teaching them empathy can be, therapy. It can be 6 months of therapy just to teach one or both empathy for each other.
Was it difficult for you all to resolve conflict in the beginning?
Uh-huh.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm Portuguese too. So, I have a switch, and if that switch gets pushed, then I go thermonuclear usually. So,
well, and we would go to bed mad. And I said, the scripture says, don't let the sun go down on your wrath. Because I was quite the shamer. I was the finger shaking shamer. And he would go, the sun doesn't set in Portugal. I'm like, I think that's probably not true.
So when you would go to bed mad and you would wake up the next day, probably still angry, a little bitter from the night before, how did you come back together?
Lots of humility, realizing that we are not the wisest people in the world, and we can solve problems if you just listen to me. We call it receiving influence. And what would happen generally after we would explode or whatever is we would go apart for a while, and then we'd come back together, and we just let's go through this again, and let me see if I can really hear you. And many times we would kind of even mirror back each other, what each other's saying, so that we could understand. We would slow down the communication a little bit so that we could understand, comprehend with each other, and then learn to respond to each other.
There's one in every couple that is more the repairer. This is Gottman stuff, and he uses the term accepting influence as well. And like one tends to be more the repair, and the other tends to be more the isolator. Sort of that. And I'm more the repairer because I hated the distance. However, as I began to move forward to repair, and he responded, he became the repairer too. See, and the repairer is the one who goes and says, can we reconnect to talk about this? I don't like this. I hate this feeling. This is miserable. And then we come together and talk about it. And so honestly, like he said, what does he say? Humility, but it was also, we didn't want to be disconnected. It's an
No.
awful feeling.
So I hear you both say something, and I agree with you. And you answered my own thought, so that the empath that you were really listening, the swamis were out. You had your headdresses on. Is that really being able to accept influence from one spouse to the other is critical empathy. So how, if somebody is unable to accept influence, what can they do to improve and strengthen that muscle? How do they go from not being able or willing to understanding and being able? What does that look like?
I have a phrase that I teach people, and we say that this phrase will heal your marriage, guaranteed. Honey, you may be right. Honey, you may be right. Which is really, really tough to say in the middle of a conflict.
Sure.
But if you can say that and mean it, it humbles you. Because we realize that many times both of us have an opinion and both of us may be right, but it may not be the right thing to do in terms of our relationship. So to step back and to acknowledge each other's feelings, each other's emotions, to really hear one another, to just slow down enough to hear and understand each other, I think is a real good beginning to resolving conflict.
When it comes to creating a kick-ass marriage, do you ever wonder how you're doing? We found that there are 13 key components that make up a thriving relationship, which is why we've created the Kickass Assessment. In this powerful free tool, you'll learn what they are and how you and your spouse are ranking in each one. And you'll get recommendations that will help you start improving today. To get your results, simply visit MatthewPHoffman.com. Again, that's MatthewPHoffman.com. It's time to start kicking ass. Let's go.
Well, Beverly, you talked a little bit earlier about a cheat sheet, and we have 13 pillars that we believe make up a successful marriage. We talked about the first three. We call them the 3 C's. And in front of you, I believe you should have the rest of the, or all of the 13.
Mm-hmm.
Of the remainder, is there one of these that really resonates with you, and why?
They're good, guys. I love the pillars. I love the pillars. And when I reread them, we realized that deeply wounded people could have difficulty with trust. That was one of the ones that if they grew up and their truster was broken because they were either abused or watched abuse, or they were made to believe they weren't good enough, or they were doubted a lot. Even overprotection, like the guy whose parents made every decision for him and he didn't grow up. And then he gets married and the wife says, honey, I don't think we need to spend money on a brand new car with the baby due at the same time. Don't tell me what to do. I don't like to be told what to do. And that is a person. I always say when I interview couples for the first few sessions, if you are, which I already know they are, if you are a person that doesn't like to be told what to do, that is a very high predictability of divorce. I just need to let you know it's a very high predictability of divorce because you don't accept each other's influence or receive each other's influence. But also you could not trust each other and you won't be selfless. Selflessness is one of the key pieces that you've got in here. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Servant leadership, selflessness. But if I'm a selfish person and it's based on insecurity, that's going to be really hard because I want my way and you're going to harm me. That's a big thing of you're going to take advantage of me. And I go, do you fear being taken advantage of in marriage? Yes, I do. And I said, well, good luck. Because marriage is just one giant take advantage of each other. Are you kidding me? You got a baby on your hip and a baby at your leg. And he comes in from work. He goes, man, I'm so tired. I really want to kick back and watch the news. Could you please heat up the bottle? I worked all day. Hey, that's what it's all about is sure. Yeah, I'll heat up the bottle because I need to be selfless. But this is what I hear most. I do A, B, C, D. Well, I do E, F, G, H. And I'm like, welcome to the world of marriage. It involves you not worrying about getting cheated or taken advantage of. It involves you saying, sure, honey, I'll be glad to do that. Well, what if she just bosses me around? I'm like, oh, she will. She will. And so will you. It's called
Don't you
life
find,
raising.
though, when you're selfless, don't you find that it comes back to you automatically? I
Mhm.
mean, Matthew will pour into me and do amazing things for me. It just makes me want to do more for him. It's
Ah,
just a
sure,
natural
sure.
reaction.
Mhm.
You are so right. And it's a biblical principle too. If I sow good, I reap good. And so I
Yeah.
say, you get mad at her because she doesn't want to talk to you and she doesn't want to be intimate with you, which is a pillar. And it's because she does not feel nurtured and cared about. She feels like an indentured servant, a maid, a cook, a babysitter, bottle washer, laundress. If you, this is so funny because if he'll come out, like if I'm doing yard work, he doesn't really like yard work. I don't have a lot to do, but I love to get dirty. I don't even wear gloves. I love to sweat and get mud all over me. And I'll be trying to dig a hole and I'll be pouncing and pouncing and pouncing. And he'll come out, Mr. Chivalrous, and he'll take the shovel and he'll just walk over and his, brute strength at 70 plus, and he'll put his foot on the shovel in one fell swoop and dig a hole. And I'm like, my hero, you are my hero. I can now plant my shrubs. And then he walks back into the air conditioning because it's quite humid here in the Carolinas. And he's like, yeah, I did that all by myself with my foot. And I'm like, this is the most amazing thing you've done. Goes to the next shrub. He's watching, and the air conditioner comes back out. I'm like, that's wonderful. What do you want for dinner? How can I help you? How can I serve you? Because you served me. And it does come back on you.
Mhm.
What about as you look at that list, Tom? What do you see? Which quality or pillar pops out to you most?
Well, as I look through it, I keep going back to one, intimacy. And the saying I have for intimacy is, into me I see. So intimacy is the willingness to be vulnerable, to be open and honest. And it really incorporates a lot of the other pillars: trust, honesty, faithfulness, appreciation, but intimacy is the key because it requires vulnerability. And many times in relationship, especially if we're guarded or we've been wounded in the past or whatever, we don't want to be vulnerable because we're afraid that if we're vulnerable, we're going to be hurt. And I say to people all the time, if you're willing to be vulnerable, you can be hurt, but you will never have intimacy without vulnerability. You'll never be able to truly be intimate if you're not willing to be vulnerable. So it really incorporates a lot of the pillars: the trust, the faith, the appreciation, selflessness, certainly the three C's, communication and all of that, because all of that is required in order to be truly intimate, to lay your soul bare before someone. But I think you can't really have a deep relationship if you're not willing to move into that quadrant. If you're not willing to be vulnerable, to be honest and open and transparent and trustful and all of those kinds of things, intimacy, I think, is the key to deep, healthy relationships.
Love that. Matthew and I both talk a lot about when you're really successful in one area of your life, and especially this area, when you have a successful marriage and you're happy, and that just spills over into other areas of your life, right? Tell me a little bit about how your marriage has spilled over into other parts of your life. It could be work, it could be family.
Well, I mean,
Mm.
that's kind of a neat question because it one of the things, and I forgot to mention this earlier, one of the things that gets you straight in your marriage pretty quick is if you're going to work with couples, you're like, I don't want to be a hypocrite. And I want to be a good example. And I don't want to like teach it and not do it. Because to me, that just lacks some integrity. And I'm not saying that, I mean, there are marriage therapists that aren't married, but for me, it didn't feel right. So we're like, okay, if we're going to teach this, we really need to do it. And we at first said, we will not teach this because we are not good at it. And we certainly are going to try it with clients, but we're not going to try our stuff. We're going to try everybody else's stuff. When we figured it out, then we started using it with clients. And it's funny, they're the ones that asked for workshops. They're the ones that said, why don't you do a workshop and teach all this at once? Okay. And then when we're teaching workshops, they said, hey, have you guys ever thought about writing a book? And we're like, no, why don't you write a book? And so then so it's kind of neat that us spilling out onto them motivated us to move further in our lives. And so it does it. You just want to give. You want to give to your children. You want to give to the community. You want to teach it. You want to help couples. And because it feels really good to, and not oh, look at me, because we say it all the time. Listen, we're not saying look at us, we're this great couple. We're saying, man, did we figure some mess out, and we sure want to help you figure some mess out. We teach mentoring in churches. We've taught all over the globe. We've taught mentors, and we say the mentor isn't the guy who's 10 years ahead and says, I think that's a rough journey down there. The mentor is just the guy that's like 2 steps ahead that said, hey, we just got in a fight Friday. There's a pothole back there. We can help you walk out of it. Because mentors are going, oh no, I don't want to mentor. I'm not in any shape to mentor. And we say, that's the best mentor. That's the one that said, just fell in the pothole. Be careful when you're walking because it's way back there and you need to move ahead.
Yeah, when you have to learn the hard way, right? And then you apply all those things that you learned, and now you're living it. You're living it and you're sharing it, which is a beautiful thing.
I guess there are 2 kind of principal things for me that tend to carry over that I think are almost unconscious, not really fully aware of it, and yet it seems to be pervasive. And I think the first thing is wisdom. And there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is kind of what you know. Wisdom is how you apply what you know. And I think one of the carryovers for me, and it's been a surprise to me because I was always kind of impulsive growing up and didn't think things through well, and it got into a lot of messes because of it. But over the years, I think just living what we do and doing that every day with couples and with each other, the thing that has come out of that is wisdom. And it's kind of interesting. We have a staff of younger people, and Bev she's very talkative, and I generally, in a staff meeting, I just kind of sit there and listen or whatever. But I'll generally say something at the end, and it always reminds me of the E.F. Hutton commercial. Remember when E.F. Hutton speaks, everyone listens, and they all do
and
that.
Don't think it doesn't aggravate me, because I've been talking and sharing all this stuff, and then Tom talks, and they're like, oh, Dr. Tom, say that again. I'm like, for Pete's sake.
What's so funny, I say something to me that's almost incidental, and they all grab their pen and they start writing,
How come nobody takes notes when I talk?
And Bev's mad because nobody took notes when she said
because you talk all the time. I'm like, ugh. But it is true.
I think the thing that carries over is wisdom. And the Bible talks a lot about wisdom in Proverbs, and really seeking it with all that's in you to seek it, because it will bring success. It will bring fulfillment in life. So I think wisdom is one thing. I think the other thing is perspective. We tend to kind of step back at the issues in our lives and gain perspective about them. How does it fit within the framework and the fabric of our lives together? The Bible says that all things work together for good. It doesn't say all things are good. It says all things work together for good. And I think with wisdom over the years and with perspective, it tends to help me step back from reacting to a situation to understand it better and then respond. And for me, being an impulsive kid growing up and not thinking things through, that's been a real gift. To be able to step back and have some perspective and not just be at the whim of my own reactivity is really, I think, wisdom applied in my life.
Well, and that reminds me, our premarital counselor was also that pastor. He was a licensed marital and family therapist and a pastor. And he did this temperament test on this. They don't use it much anymore. It's called the Taylor-Johnson, but those of us who are our age know that's pretty the only tool that they had to determine your temperament. And our temperament was like, he was like off the charts impulsive. And I was way, way high on compulsive, meaning getting things done. And so the pastor sat with us and he goes, Tom, you're like almost 100%.
No. He said, you scored 105% on the impulsive scale.
Yeah.
And I said, how do you score more than 100% on anything? He said, I don't know, you did.
And he goes, since it's you, he knew him. He, knew him when he was a teenager and as a young adult. He goes, since it's you, that makes a lot of sense to me. But
I love it.
See, where you differ. Also, see, don't forget, you marry your opposite because they add to you, they balance you. And when you get married, when you're on drugs, you go, oh, that's so great. She's so compulsive. She gets everything done and dots every I and crosses every T. Then when all the drugs wear off and the power struggle starts, you're like, oh, you're so impulsive. Good grief, you didn't buy a car. You did not buy a car without asking me. And he's like, yeah, I did. I'm like, oh my gosh. So knowing your differences and then accepting them and realizing really God says grow. So I'm far more relaxed and he's far more compulsive now. See, he's
great.
more like, let me be deliberate.
So a lot of differences there. And you're talking about what things were like when you first got married. And we're going to kind of our last question here. As we close out is we want you guys to go back in time, Tom, and you're going to put your arms on your unmarried self. And if you could give your unmarried self one piece of advice, you first, and then Beverly, you're second, so you have more time to think and plan. What would you say? What would you say, Tom, to your unmarried self?
You don't have to have it your way all the time.
Good.
You can get a lot farther by learning to compromise and have consensus in relationship than just determining what you want and being adamant about it. So relax and don't be so reactive. Be a little calmer in life. Understand that all things really do work together for good. And be here for the long haul.
I think for me, it's don't be so idealistic. I was just the consummate romantic and my expectations were so high. So it's be realistic. Life is hard and marriage is hard work. So don't come into it thinking that the courtship and all the love cocktail and the chemicals that are released we don't say falling in love anymore. We call it tripping into infatuation because it's not really love. It's really more of an idealized image. And be more feet on the ground, realistic about marriage so that you don't get for me, I was so crushed and upset. And then I judged him harshly. So be realistic and really do some research on marriage, read some books and learn about it because, taking two people, putting them in a confined space, if you've got two careers, raising small humans and paying mortgages and bills from different backgrounds, that's going to be hard work. That's not going to be easy. So kind of know that going in so you're not so disappointed.
Yeah, that's great.
That is a great question, though. I have to tell you, I'm going to plagiarize that question from now on.
Yeah, it's a good question.
So I'll give you credit for it. That's a great question.
Oh, my pleasure. Our pleasure. Well, what a treat it's been to spend some time with you all today and learn about where you came from and how you made it work and how you're helping other couples do the same thing in their lives. We're so grateful for your time and thank you for the work that you're doing to invest in other people and their relationships so they can take that number one and make it what they'd like it to be.
Yeah, we truly appreciate your wisdom and your perspective. And, you bring so much experience to this podcast for our listeners. And we're just really grateful that you're open and willing to share.
So if people want to learn more about you, or where should they look to find you? If they want to connect to you too and learn about your books and your work.
If they go to rogerscc.com, C as in cat, or Rodgers Christian Counseling, very soon we're going to have the Soul Healing Love site up and running. where we're going to have lots of articles and, putting a lot of the things we've done so they can go read. We really want to make this a legacy so they can go learn about, we've written articles for magazines and books and workbooks. And so the Soul Healing Love Site is going to make that accessible to people so that they can learn as much as they can about helping others or growing in their own marriage. But it's Rodgers Christian Counseling or RodgersCC.com.
Perfect. Well, we can't wait for that Soul Love Healing to come out so we can read that, and we'll share that with our listeners so they know where to find you. Again, thank you so much for your time and your pearls and your wisdom and your knowledge that you've applied. And we're so grateful to have the time with you today. Thank you.
Yes, great to be with you both.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it.
That's all we've got for this episode of the Kickass Couples Podcast. If you like the content of this show, you'll love Matthew's upcoming book, Kickass Husband, Winning at Life, Marriage, and Sex. To receive a digital mini book of quotes and images from the book, all you have to do is rate this show and leave a review in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you tune in to listen. Then email us a screenshot of your review at podcast@kickasscouplespodcast.com, and we'll get it over to you right away.
Until next time, remember, happily ever after doesn't just happen, it's on purpose.